Hi everyone, and welcome to Summer Workshop Retreat hosted by Peggy Dean. I'm Jamie, and I like to draw, paint, and share what inspires me from my everyday. And today I'd like to share a sketchbook practice that you might find helpful if you're feeling stuck or in need of a change. And it's this: whenever I get a new sketchbook, I just paint my favorite tools or what I'm using at the moment. So if that sounds like fun, I hope you'll join me. So let's go. And these are some of the first pages of my sketchbook, and they're just a great reminder of, what I was using at the time, the style that I was exploring. And so I think this is going to be a really fun workshop where we can create a memory and hopefully we'll be able to look back on it. So we'll be using a watercolor sketchbook. If you don't have one, that's all right. You can just paint on a single sheet. And then for the watercolor paint, you can use the ones that come in a pan or squeeze them from a tube, paper towel or rag, a cup of water, a brush, and a pencil. So I just set up a basic still life to get an idea of where I want to place items. And then I did a sketch based on that. And for the palette, even though I don't have it anymore, I really liked the small compact size. So I based it on an old painting that I did. Okay, so as I'm painting this initial layer, most of my colors are going to be fairly light to a medium tone. So that gives me room to add darks and create that nice contrast. And if you find that your paint is pooling in one spot, go ahead and tilt the paper and then it'll help move the paint in the space. Now I just rinsed off my brush and I'm going to grab my next color. And this can reflect what's in your palette, not necessarily what's in mine. And as I'm painting this rectangle, I'm leaving some white space, and that is going to kind of give you that impression that what you're painting is wet and it's not a flat object. As I'm painting this, I'm noticing that the rectangles are a little bit too short. So I'm just going back, even though it's a little bit on the dry side, I'm just adding to the shape to expand it a little bit. Sometimes that will happen where you have to make adjustments as you go, and the conditions might not always be ideal, but it's where the trial and error really helps in learning how the paint moves and what to do next time better. As you're painting, it's a good idea to really clean your brush in between, especially if you're making a shift in color where, for example, I'm painting like a lemon yellow, and if I still had some blue on my brush, in this situation, it wouldn't be ideal because you don't want to make green. So just keep an eye out for that. And this little pocket palette had different watercolor pan sizes, and so that's why these squares are kind of teeny. Moving on to the next color, reserving again some highlight. What's really neat about this particular subject matter is everyone's painting could be slightly different because their color palette and what they have and the colors they've chosen to include in their palette is going to be different. It's going to reflect your style, your preferences. So I think that's really neat. With the first row done, I hope you're feeling a little bit more comfortable with how much paint to use and how much water. And now, as we move on to the second row, it's just more about having fun and just kind of getting into the flow of painting. There are times when I won't include a green just because it's more of a convenience color since you can mix it. But once in a while, it's nice to have it ready to go to use. And you can always modify it a little bit by adding another color like red or orange. As I'm painting each rectangle, you probably noticed I'm leaving a little bit of a gap in between the colors, and that just gives it a little bit more light and makes everything just pop a little bit more. If you happen to accidentally paint into the next color, that's okay. It's kind of that happy accident and it gives that watercolor look. And really, I would just leave it. It's just, we're just having fun in our sketchbook and nothing has to be perfect or even close to that. And you'll notice in the end, it kind of adds to the charm of your painting. So, yeah, just leave it in. And our rainbow of colors is nearly complete. So now let's move on to the actual palette. And this one happens to be made of metal. So I'm going to mix up a grayish color. And to do so, I just took some blue, some red, and some yellow. So all the primaries. And I'm mixing it so that I get kind of a neutral, muted color and using a lot of water. So now I'm going to paint the top of the lid and I'm using the brush, holding it loosely and just dragging it across to create that edge and then bringing it down using whatever colors remaining and just closing off that shape. And then it curves inward, creating the other border, and then pressing down a little bit more to create a wider width. And then the little clasp at the top. And I just slightly wet my brush so that I can use the remaining color to show the area where we mix. And then you can just throw in your favorite colors, let them kind of play on the paper. The messier, the better. And you can even splatter some color to make it a little bit more loose and fun. And when I step back and look, I'm noticing there's a little bit too much white space. So what I'm doing is taking the gray and kind of glazing it over in some areas. And your painting, it might not need it. So just take a look. And if you want to keep the white space, you can definitely just keep it there. It's better to, I think, have too much and then later change your mind than to have too little and have to bring it back. By now, everything should be relatively dry, and so we can move on to the shadows. And for that, I'm mixing a blue and a red to get a nice purpley color. I'm just going to add the shadow along the right side of our palette, kind of just doing it in one swipe, and then along the bottom. So now that it looks like it's resting on a surface instead of just floating on the paper. And now, since everything is dry, we can have the freedom of adding our darks without losing them. So I'm just picking and choosing different spots. So along the bottom, At this stage, I'm trying not to put it everywhere because if it's everywhere, then it's nowhere. And painting just to give the impression and hint of something, I think makes the painting stronger than just spelling it out for the viewer. So that is our palette. We started with initial wash, added some darks and shadows to create some contrast. And now we can move on to the rest of our tools. And for your reference, this is again the setup that I did. But as I'm painting each brush, I'm actually going to hold it and get an idea of the shape and the color. Now, although this brush is actually black, I decided to just go with a kind of a deep green color instead. And you can choose to change up how you paint your tools. It doesn't have to be a photorealistic representation. It can be your interpretation and the colors that you want to use. And as I move towards the bottom, I added a little bit more color. And now I'm moving on to the bottom part of the handle, leaving a little gap for the white piece and letting the paper do the work for that. And just like the little paint pans we did, I'm reserving some white space, and this will create the highlights that we need to show that it's reflecting. And now we can move on to the metal portion. Again, it's that same gray that we used to create the palette. And with lots of water, I'm going to paint the shape of it. Not filling in every single spot because it is shiny. We can use that same color kind of to drag up into the bristles. Tilting the paper to help the paint move a little bit. And we're just kind of setting it up as the initial wash again so that we can add darks a little bit later. The next brush I'm going to paint is the one I'm actually using. So I just grabbed a smaller version, the Pigeon Letters Studio brush. And I'm going to start with the handle, which is kind of like a light oak color. So I'm mixing a little bit of alizarin with some yellow and a touch of blue. And then just dragging down the color and reserving the middle portion for the black labeling. And it's okay if you cover it up because it's darker than the layer underneath. And then for the bottom part, it's black, but rather than just use straight black, I mixed my blue with a little bit of like an earth tone, like burnt sienna, and that'll give you a nice rich dark. And I let it blend into the wooden portion. And I'm just observing and seeing how I can use the paint to communicate what I'm seeing. And the more you do these kind of observational paintings, the better you'll become at conveying your ideas on paper. And so now we're doing the brush, the bristles, and like before, starting out very light so that it gives me room to go darker later. Here I'm just taking advantage of the fact that it's still wet and you can work more color to create a nice blend. The spot I left for the label, I'm using mostly just paint, very little water because the area is still damp and I don't want things to bleed too much into each other so that the sections are clear. Since this is just an impression of the brush rather than, you know, painstakingly lettering the label, I'm just leaving certain spots blank to represent the lettering on there. And then kind of just making marks to represent, you know, the script and the size of the brush. I'm gonna grab my next brush, and it is a really thin one. It's called a rigger. And this one is kind of a darkish blue. So again, I mixed my blue with a little bit of burnt sienna and trying to really observe the shape. And I see that it's a bit thicker towards the top of the handle and then it narrows as I move down. And I'm also leaving some white space for the little sticker at the bottom and the little lettering showing the brand and the size. And for each of these, I'm noticing that I'm following kind of the same order where I start with the handle, move up to the metal portion, and then the bristles. You can paint it in any order you find comfortable or easiest. I just found that it helps me see something relatively quickly and then get something down on the paper and then build upon that. And here's our last brush. It's aquash. It's one that's where there's a barrel to keep water. So it's great for traveling. And it used to be like a light blue. So I'm just going to paint it like that, even though mine has turned like a muddy silver color. And I'm using the brush and just drawing each portion. I think the reason I included this brush, even though it might not be my absolute favorite, is the variety of shapes and the contrast it creates. And it's something different to paint. You know, it doesn't have a metal component. It's made out of plastic, and the way I'm holding it, you actually can't really see the brush. So it's just a different way and something new to try to paint. There was a little bit of space in between, so I decided to include a little kneaded eraser. And you don't have to if, you know, your composition seems okay, but it's just fun to add. And now I'm doing a little paint tube. And that's kind of where the label is. And the bottom is like a silvery color. And I'm just going to finish it off with the cap, keeping it very, very loose. Now that our initial wash is down, we can move on to the darks and shadows. And I'm going to start by mixing my blue with my brown and kind of just flicking my brush to create the strands in the bristles, starting from the bottom and just kind of fanning them out. For the metal portion where I can see kind of the ridges, I'm adding a darker color there to give it a little bit more dimension. And for the rigger brush, the bristles are kind of more of a dirty, like ochre color. So I just mixed a darker yellow. And then for the water brush, a dark blue to accent the edges. And I'm just going back and redefining some of the areas, just dabbing a little bit of darks here and there. And when you're ready, we can start adding the shadows. And again, it's a purpley mixture, relatively light, but I want to try to get it in one loose stroke along the right side. And it's okay if it blends a little bit with the paint that's already on there, because you don't want any hard edges. They should be kind of soft and kind of melt into the paper. You can use any color for the shadows. Sometimes I'll just take what's remaining on the palette and just mix them all up, and it'll look harmonious because the colors are already in the painting. So you can try that as well. To add a little bit more liveliness, I'm just getting some paint on my brush and tapping it, creating splatters. The more random, the better. So I would say here the sketch is pretty much done, but to add a little bit of context, we can add some details with some lettering. So I'm just writing, painting my tools. And it's just a way to kind of frame the page. So this is optional, but I think it's really fun to add it. And feel free to choose whatever colors you'd like. And now I'm filling in that negative space with some arrows. You could use dash lines, or maybe you don't want to put anything there. That's fine. And we can add the date so we can look back on it. And I believe this is going to be in August. And now that it's dry, I can write it in. And just adding a little drop shadow to each of the letters to make them stand out a little bit more. And the very last thing we can do is just write out exactly what the tools are. You can use a pen, you can even do it with your paintbrush. I would just recommend if you're using a pen that it's waterproof just in case. And yeah, it'll just be a nice memento to look back on to see what you were using at the time. And writing out the colors, that's always fun. And then you can see how your colors evolve as you grow and explore and try different things. And we reached the end. Yay! So I really hope that you enjoyed painting and exploring in your sketchbook, especially if it's your first page. Now you've broken it in and there's nothing to be afraid of. You can just turn the next page and work on the next painting. So thanks so much for watching. If you'd like to share your work, you can just tag me on Instagram at Inks and Things. All right, stay creative, everyone. See ya.